The house sat back from the road as if it had learned to hide, its windows blind with age, its porch sagging under a weight that had nothing to do with wood. Locals said the land soured anything planted on it, that animals avoided the shade, that even the wind passed through too quickly. Long before anyone dared to ask why, the ground had already swallowed the answers. Inside those walls, a man once ruled with a voice so soft it never needed to rise. He believed control was most complete when it felt inevitable, when people moved as numbers rather than souls, when blood could be arranged like columns in a ledger. At night, the quarters breathed with the sounds of people trying not to be heard. Orders had been given earlier in the day, spoken without emotion, pairing names that shared the same mother, the same father, the same terrified childhood. The master called it necessity, improvement, destiny shaped by his hand. Those forced to obey learned to look past one another's faces, to survive by emptying their eyes of recognition. Children were born into this quiet, their cries swallowed quickly, their futures written before they could speak. Years later, when the house finally emptied and the fields grew wild, the silence did not lift. It moved instead, carried in bodies that limped, lungs that failed, minds that fractured under inherited weight. Doctors would note symptoms without origins, families would avoid mirrors, and towns would learn not to ask certain questions. The master's name faded from memory, but his design endured, etched into bone and breath, waiting for someone brave enough to listen to what the blood had been trying to say all along. The first turning point begins with the accidental survival of a ledger that was never meant to be read outside the master's study, a book bound in cracked leather and hidden beneath floorboards where damp and insects had already begun their slow work. When it is finally uncovered decades later, it appears at first to be an ordinary plantation record, neat columns of dates, names, and tallies written in a precise, almost reverent hand. But as the pages are studied more closely, a pattern emerges that unsettles anyone who knows how families are supposed to form. Children are listed with mothers identified clearly, yet the space where fathers should be named is repeatedly left blank or marked with the same vague symbol. Surnames recur in tight clusters, generation after generation, looping back on themselves in a way that feels deliberate rather than accidental. The deeper one reads, the more the ledger begins to feel less like a record of lives and more like an inventory of outcomes. Births are annotated with brief notes about strength, sickness, or usefulness, reducing human beginnings to assessments of value. Certain women's names appear far more often than others, their bodies tracked like resources, while certain family lines are crossed and recrossed as if the master were experimenting with blood itself. What makes this discovery especially chilling is the absence of emotion in the writing. There is no acknowledgement of suffering, no hesitation, only the cold confidence of someone who believed he had the right to arrange human relationships to suit his own logic. As scholars and descendants piece together the meaning of these entries, they realize the ledger was a tool of control more powerful than chains. It reveals a system in which identity was deliberately blurred, where children were denied the basic knowledge of who they were so that loyalty and fear could be more easily enforced. By erasing fathers and repeating surnames, the master created a closed world in which confusion was normal and resistance nearly impossible. This single book becomes the first undeniable proof that what had long been whispered as rumor was in fact policy, designed carefully and carried out over years. The ledger does not shout its horror, it whispers it calmly, making the reader complicit in understanding how cruelty can hide behind order and ink when power believes it will never be questioned. The second turning point unfolds not through documents but through sound, through the low, careful whispers that moved from one cabin to another once the sun went down and the fields went quiet. These were not rumors spoken loudly or freely, but fragments passed only when trust had been tested, when faces were turned away from doors and children were already asleep. People began to notice that certain pairings were not coincidences. Brothers and sisters were being sent to the same quarters, told to share the same narrow beds, ordered with the same calm authority used for assigning labor. No explanation was ever offered, and questions were met with looks that warned survival depended on silence. The master framed these decisions in the language of efficiency, speaking of strength, obedience, and continuity as if he were discussing crops rather than lives. Overseers repeated his words without understanding or caring, enforcing arrangements that violated every instinct of kinship the enslaved people still clung to. Mothers learned to look away when their children were taken at night, knowing resistance would only bring punishment that spread to everyone. Fathers, when known, were powerless to intervene, reduced to watching the rules of blood and family collapse under command. What made the cruelty sharper was its routine nature, the way it became just another order written on a slate and erased by morning. Within the quarters, fear reshaped relationships. Siblings avoided eye contact, terrified of what recognition might demand of them. Some prayed for illness or injury to make themselves undesirable, while others submitted, believing obedience might spare their families worse suffering. Over time, the whispers grew more precise, forming a shared understanding that this was not random abuse but a deliberate system. People spoke of the master's belief that shared blood produced loyalty, that confusion weakened rebellion, that breaking natural bonds made control permanent. Whether or not anyone fully understood his reasoning, they felt its consequences in their bodies and their dreams. These whispered truths marked a shift from individual terror to collective awareness. Once people understood the pattern, they also understood the trap. The knowledge itself became dangerous, something that had to be hidden even as it burned to be acknowledged. Silence turned into a survival strategy, a shield passed from one generation to the next. This moment is crucial because it shows how evil does not rely solely on force, but on the slow poisoning of trust and kinship, until even the victims begin to measure their words, their glances, and their memories as carefully as the master measured bloodlines. The third turning point centers on the midwife, a woman whose role placed her at the threshold between secrecy and truth, between what was ordered and what could not be hidden. She had delivered hundreds of children across the plantation and nearby lands, her hands trusted because they were necessary, her presence tolerated because birth itself could not be postponed. Over time, she began to notice things others dismissed as misfortune. Infants arrived weak far too often, their limbs twisted, their cries thin and breathless. Some survived only days, others lived with bodies that never fully obeyed them. At first she blamed hunger, exhaustion, the endless strain placed on enslaved women, but the patterns refused to stay quiet. She began to keep her own private record, nothing as neat as the master's ledger, just marks scratched into the margins of an old prayer book she carried beneath her shawl. A symbol for a child born too small, another for one whose eyes did not focus, another for those who never drew a full breath at all. Beside these marks, she noted the mother's name, and slowly, unwillingly, she saw the same names return again and again. Sisters. Brothers. Families folded inward upon themselves. What frightened her most was not the sickness, but its predictability. This was not chance. It was design revealing itself through flesh. The midwife could say nothing openly. To speak would mean death, not just for herself but for those she served. Instead, she began small acts of resistance that looked like care. She lingered longer with certain mothers, taught them how to hide infants during inspections, how to bind fragile limbs, how to quiet coughing fits before overseers heard. She warned young girls in coded language, stories that sounded like superstition but carried truth beneath them. Her knowledge became a burden she carried alone, a weight that bent her posture and hollowed her eyes. In recognizing the source of the suffering, she crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. She no longer saw individual tragedies but a manufactured future, children born already condemned by decisions made before their conception. This turning point matters because it marks the moment when cruelty becomes undeniable, when evidence moves from rumor to embodied proof. Through the midwife's eyes, the bloodline stops being an abstract horror and becomes a living record written in bone, breath, and quiet graves behind the cabins where no markers were allowed. The fourth turning point arrives unexpectedly, carried on smoke and chaos rather than whispers or ink. A fire breaks out near the main house during a dry season, fed by old timber and years of neglect, spreading faster than anyone anticipates. Enslaved workers are forced to form lines with buckets while overseers shout conflicting orders, more concerned with saving furniture and ledgers than lives. In the confusion, part of the house collapses inward, exposing a section that had long been sealed off, a narrow stairway leading down beneath the structure itself. When the flames are finally controlled, what remains is a blackened opening that was never meant to be seen. Curiosity mixes with fear as a small group is ordered to clear the debris. Beneath the house they find a cellar unlike any other on the property, not used for food or tools but lined with shelves and iron fixtures. The air is stale, heavy with the smell of mold and something older, something sour. Inside are boxes of documents wrapped in oilcloth, preserved carefully against time, alongside objects meant for punishment rather than record. Shackles sized for children, worn ropes, and a narrow bench stained dark tell a story that no official account ever mentioned. This hidden space reveals that the system of control was not only planned but rehearsed, documented, and enforced in private. Among the papers are supplementary records that mirror the ledger but go further, noting failed pairings, disciplinary actions, and outcomes deemed unacceptable. The language is clinical, stripped of humanity, treating pain as data and resistance as error. What shocks those who glimpse these pages is the level of intention. Nothing was improvised. Every cruelty had a reason, every violation a justification written down and stored away like a family secret too valuable to destroy. The cellar becomes proof that silence was engineered as carefully as the bloodlines themselves. Though the discovery is quickly suppressed and the entrance resealed, the damage is done. A few people have seen too much, and knowledge, once uncovered, cannot be forced back into darkness unchanged. Even those who never enter the cellar sense a shift, an understanding that the master's power was sustained not just by authority but by hidden spaces where truth was locked away. This moment deepens the horror because it confirms that the suffering above ground was supported by an underground world of planning and punishment, a foundation literally built beneath the house, holding it up with secrets and fear. The fifth turning point emerges through the survival of a single child who should not have lived, a child whose continued breathing unsettles everyone who understands the pattern that has already claimed so many others. Born during a storm that drowned out cries and prayers alike, the infant arrives small and fragile, limbs drawn tight as if resisting the world itself. The midwife recognizes the signs immediately, the same markers she has seen carved into too many short lives, and she quietly prepares herself for another death she will have to explain away. But the child does not fade. Days pass, then weeks, and though sickness clings stubbornly, life refuses to loosen its grip. As the child grows, the cost of survival becomes visible. Bones bend under their own weight, speech comes slowly, pain shadows even ordinary movement. Yet behind the physical damage, something sharper takes root. The child listens more than speaks, watches more than plays, absorbing fragments of adult fear and unfinished conversations. Where other children learn obedience through repetition, this one learns memory. The silences, the flinches, the way certain names are never spoken aloud all become part of an internal map of danger and truth. Survival itself becomes a form of witnessing. Those around the child react with unease rather than relief. A living reminder of the system's failure is dangerous. Overseers note the weakness with irritation, the master with detached interest, as if evaluating an unexpected variable in an experiment. Some believe the child should have been allowed to die, that endurance only prolongs suffering and risk. Others begin to project meaning onto the survival, seeing it as a sign, a curse, or a quiet promise that not every outcome can be controlled. The child is moved often, denied stable attachment, kept just visible enough to be monitored and just invisible enough to be forgotten. What makes this turning point crucial is that survival introduces memory into a system designed to erase it. This child carries the marks of forced bloodlines not only in body but in awareness, becoming a living archive no cellar can contain. Years later, when names and records have been lost or burned, when adults have trained themselves not to remember, the child's existence stands as proof that something went wrong and endured. In a world built to manufacture silence, survival itself becomes an act that threatens exposure, a quiet defiance written into flesh and carried forward against every intention of the master. The sixth turning point takes shape when the master's heir comes fully into his inheritance, not just of land and wealth, but of knowledge that was never meant to be shared. Raised within the house yet shielded from its darkest rooms, he grows up sensing that something beneath the prosperity is wrong, though no one ever explains what. It is only after the master's health begins to fail that fragments of the truth are revealed, not through confession but through responsibility. He is shown the records, the controlled pairings, the outcomes measured in sickness and obedience, all presented as necessity rather than cruelty. The system is framed as fragile, something that will collapse if mishandled, something that depends on his discretion to survive. The heir's horror is immediate but complicated. He understands enough to recognize the violence, yet he also understands the consequences of exposure. The plantation's wealth, his family's standing, and his own future are all tied to what must never be spoken. He tells himself that he did not design this, that guilt belongs to the generation before him, but the knowledge sits heavily in his chest. For a brief time, there is the possibility of rupture, of refusal, of letting the truth destroy what it must. Instead, fear proves stronger than conscience. Silence becomes the compromise he convinces himself is survival. In choosing not to dismantle the system, the heir does something more insidious than continuation. He refines it. Orders become less direct, records more fragmented, punishments more hidden. What was once enforced through blunt authority is now maintained through ambiguity and habit. The forced pairings continue, but spoken of only indirectly. The suffering remains, but is absorbed into routine. By softening the surface, he ensures the structure beneath remains intact. The cruelty becomes quieter, and therefore harder to challenge. This moment is critical because it shows how atrocity persists not only through monsters, but through inheritors who lack the courage to end what benefits them. The heir's silence legitimizes the past and secures its future, transforming personal revulsion into institutional secrecy. He does not need to believe in the system's righteousness, only in its usefulness. By protecting the name and the estate, he binds himself to the suffering embedded in both, ensuring that the bloodline of control extends beyond one man's lifetime and into an era that will claim ignorance while living comfortably on the results. The seventh turning point arrives with the appearance of an outsider, a traveling preacher whose presence unsettles the plantation precisely because he does not belong to its carefully managed order. He comes offering sermons and prayer, moving from settlement to settlement, welcomed because faith is considered harmless, even useful, in keeping people compliant. At first, he speaks only of suffering and endurance, of trials meant to test the soul, and the overseers pay him little attention. But as he listens, as he eats among the enslaved and walks the grounds without haste, he begins to notice what others have trained themselves not to see. He hears the same surnames repeated across generations in ways that make no sense. He notices children who resemble one another too closely despite being listed as cousins or not related at all. He sees bodies bent by illness that should be rare, minds clouded too early, grief that feels practiced rather than fresh. His questions are gentle at first, framed as concern, as curiosity born of care. He asks about family histories, about births and deaths, about why certain cabins hold so many small graves nearby. Each question tightens the air. Conversations stop when he approaches. Eyes lower. Silence answers for everyone. The preacher does not understand at first that he is trespassing into forbidden knowledge. When he requests to see records, claiming an interest in documenting the spiritual lives of those he serves, he is refused politely, then firmly. He notices how quickly overseers appear when he lingers too long with certain families, how invitations to preach are suddenly withdrawn. Still, he presses on, convinced that what he senses is not just sin but structure, not individual cruelty but an organized violation of natural law. He speaks once, carefully, of the danger of confusing blood and authority, of treating human beings as livestock, and that sermon is his last. He disappears without witness. Some say he left at dawn, warned away for his own good. Others believe he was detained, questioned, silenced where no one would hear. No body is found, no explanation offered, and within days it is as if he never existed. His absence becomes a lesson more powerful than his words. Those who had begun to wonder learn what curiosity costs. This turning point matters because it marks the boundary of the system's tolerance, proving that even moral authority must be erased when it threatens exposure, and that silence is enforced not only through fear among the enslaved, but through the removal of anyone who might carry the truth beyond the land where it was meant to die. The eighth turning point unfolds with the collapse of the plantation system itself, not through justice or revelation, but through the blunt force of historical change. War reaches the region unevenly, rumors arriving before soldiers do, and when emancipation finally becomes unavoidable, it feels less like liberation and more like an evacuation from a long-sealed structure. The house empties, the fields fall quiet, and the carefully maintained order dissolves almost overnight. Records are burned, buildings abandoned, and those who once lived under rigid control are suddenly forced into motion, carrying little more than their bodies and whatever history has been etched into them. Freedom brings choice, but it also brings exposure. Families formed under coercion scatter into nearby towns, into hills and settlements where no one knows their full stories. Surnames are changed or simplified, relationships redefined or left deliberately vague. Parents avoid explaining too much, believing that silence might protect their children from a past that still feels dangerous to name. Yet the body does not forget as easily as the tongue. Illness follows them outward, settling into new communities that assume poverty or bad luck as explanation. Doctors note recurring deformities and chronic weakness without understanding their shared origin, treating symptoms as isolated cases rather than echoes of a single design. In these towns, shame becomes a second inheritance. People learn which questions not to answer, which relatives not to acknowledge. Marriages are arranged quickly, sometimes recklessly, in hopes of burying rumors beneath new blood, but the damage is already threaded too deeply. Children grow up sensing that something about their families is wrong without being told why. They feel watched by neighbors who notice patterns they cannot explain, who whisper about curses or bad stock, language that mirrors the logic of the master long after his authority is gone. What makes this moment devastating is its quiet continuity. The system no longer needs overseers or ledgers to persist. It survives through dispersal, through the way suffering blends into the background of everyday life. The plantation disappears from maps, but its consequences integrate seamlessly into the wider world, unrecognized and therefore unchallenged. By the time the original source of the harm is forgotten, its effects have multiplied, embedded in multiple bloodlines and communities, ensuring that the end of the plantation does not mean the end of what it created, only a widening of the space in which its legacy can hide. The ninth turning point emerges generations later when the legacy of the plantation begins to intersect with the scrutiny of science and the curiosity of outsiders. A researcher arrives in the region, drawn not by rumor but by a trail of medical anomalies that have long been dismissed as coincidence or poor record-keeping. Families carry histories of disease, deformity, and premature death, yet local doctors treat each case in isolation, unaware of the connections running through multiple generations. The researcher begins to notice the patterns, subtle at first, recurring surnames, repeated physical traits, clusters of conditions that defy normal explanation. What had been whispered across towns now begins to take shape under the lens of observation and data, revealing a lineage of suffering that spans decades. As the researcher digs deeper, the puzzle grows more unsettling. Oral histories from older family members are fragmented, colored by shame and fear, but they all point to one place and one source, a plantation where authority had once dictated who could marry, who could bear children, and whose blood should mingle with whom. Every interview, every ledger found in attics or behind false walls, confirms the same truth: the decisions of a single man had cascaded outward, shaping bodies, lives, and communities far beyond his reach. Even after decades, the echoes of his control manifest in ways that science cannot fully explain, leaving descendants with inherited consequences they had never understood. The researcher begins to map the anomalies, tracing lines of kinship and illness that converge unnervingly. Towns once thought separate reveal hidden connections, families linked through the same patterns of deformity, weakness, and chronic disease. There is a moral weight to this work as well. Uncovering the truth feels almost sacrilegious, exposing private pain in the name of clarity. Letters and records become evidence, yet nothing can fully capture the lived reality of bodies shaped by intentional cruelty. The researcher realizes that the plantation was not merely a site of exploitation, but a laboratory of human suffering whose results have migrated outward, embedding themselves in unsuspecting communities. This turning point is crucial because it shifts the narrative from rumor and secrecy to undeniable evidence. The atrocities are no longer contained in whispers, documents, or memories, they are inscribed in flesh and blood. What had been a local horror becomes a scientific and historical revelation, showing that the effects of deliberate control over human reproduction are measurable, persistent, and devastating. The researcher's work proves that the master's legacy is not confined to the past, it survives in living descendants, a reminder that cruelty designed with intent can echo through time, silently shaping generations who never knew its origin. The 10th turning point emerges as the final, devastating revelation of the plantation's enduring legacy, showing that the true horror was not only in the physical suffering but in the culture of silence that had been meticulously cultivated for decades. Generations had grown up with invisible rules, learning to navigate shame, illness, and deformity without speaking of their origins. Families carried trauma quietly, encoding fear and guilt into everyday life, passing it along as inheritance alongside names and property. The deliberate erasure of fathers, the repeated forced pairings, the secrecy surrounding births and deaths, all of it had created not just a bloodline marked by disease, but a society conditioned to avoid truth at almost any cost. The researcher, tracing these patterns across families and towns, uncovers the scope of the silence and its consequences. They find descendants who cannot name their grandparents or siblings with certainty, who hesitate when asked about family history, whose bodies reflect damage accumulated over generations. What is most chilling is the realization that knowledge itself had been weaponized. Anyone who saw too much or asked too many questions risked disappearance, punishment, or social exile. In essence, the plantation had trained its victims to police themselves, ensuring the system's endurance long after its physical infrastructure was gone. The horror of what was done is magnified by the quiet complicity of fear, which becomes as binding as chains once were. As the researcher digs deeper, they find evidence that even communities beyond the immediate area carry the echoes of the master's policies. Marriages are sometimes arranged in secrecy, children inherit not just physical ailments but unspoken taboos, and ordinary life is shadowed by unacknowledged histories. The original cruelty created a framework in which silence becomes a protective mechanism, one that spreads faster than the disease it accompanies. This revelation underscores that the master's control was never limited to immediate violence. It was a blueprint for intergenerational submission, a method of manipulating not only bodies but consciousness, ensuring that trauma and obedience persisted even when no one was actively watching. This turning point crystallizes the ultimate impact of the plantation's legacy. It is not merely the repeated abuse or the physical deformities that shock, but the depth of control over memory, knowledge, and identity. By the time the truth is reconstructed, the researcher understands that the master's design has succeeded beyond his lifetime. He created a culture in which suffering could be inherited silently, shaping the present and future without overt intervention. The bloodline of disease is terrifying, but the bloodline of silence is unbreakable, embedding itself in the very framework of family and community, ensuring that the past continues to speak, even when no one dares to listen.